Today, as you can see, we're going to be talking about a history of the Music Foundation. So I do want to note first that a lot of this comes from my predecessor, Nola Canals, who wrote a history of the foundation before she left. So a lot of this is coming from her work, so I'd like to thank her for that. And then just to also recognize that a lot of people have been involved in the history of the foundation. I am not going to be able to mention every single person because we would be here for 3 months. So if I leave someone out, I apologize, but it is just a quick overview. So to begin with the foundation, we have to start before the foundation existed, with the origins of the ideas of preserving Moravian music. Now, first off, I don't need to tell anybody that Moravians do not throw anything away. And so the history of keeping in archives goes back to the beginnings of the church. Now, music in particular, I talked about this a few months ago when we did our introduction to Moravian music. Music has always played a vital part in the life of the church. So it would make sense that you have an organization that loves its history and telling its story and doesn't throw anything away, that also loves music. Obviously, they're going to keep and preserve a lot of those records. And so from the beginning, music has always played a very vital part of Moravians and how they tell their own stories. One could argue that one of the earliest predecessors to the Music Foundation was a closet that was built over here in Salem. And there's a note from the Elders Conference on the 30th of June, 1790. And they mention that consideration was given to the matter of music as the call of Brother Frederick Peta to another place leaves the congregation without a director of music. In the first place, it is understood that the Altestan Conference prepares the odes and has all music matters under general supervision. To carry on the music and attend to all details connected with it, we knew no one to suggest except Brother Reutz. We hesitate to place the music and the instruments entirely in his hands, and agreed to have a closet made in which it can be placed in the small saal, and Brother Reutz shall keep the key. Brother Peter shall give the music and a catalog of it to Brother Reutz if he is willing to take charge of it. So 1790, a small little closet is built to contain the music and some of the instruments. And if we wanted to make the argument, that is in some respects kind of the early beginnings of what would become the Music Foundation. And the thoughts of needing to preserve this music was not something that suddenly sprang up in the 20th century. Hagen, the pastor and famous musician, composer, in 1878 made a note to the Northern Province Synod that there's a fund of original manuscript church music never before printed in the musical repertoire of the Venerable Church at Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, on which the compiler might draw to excellent purpose. Ought we not to make the attempt to preserve to ourselves and to others these precious musical treasures? And so you can see, even in the 19th century, there were people arguing that this is music that needs to be both preserved but also shared with others. If you're curious what we're looking at over here, an old view of Salem, but the silhouette over here, this is of Hagen, the man who made that comment about needing to save this music. Now, not much happened until about the 1930s. And in the 1930s, a small spark begins to emerge about the importance of the music of the Moravian Church. Exactly, the Foals. So in the 1930s, a man named Hans T. David, who was a musicologist, he was a specialist actually in the music of Bach and wrote some of the seminal works on Bach scholarship in the early 20th century. But he had received a grant to study music in the Moravian Church. And so he went into the archives and began to look at some of the pieces that were there. And in collaboration with the New York Public Library, he published a few pieces of Moravian music. And this started to show people that there was this treasure trove in these archives that no one had paid any attention to up until that point. One of the scholars who was interested in this was a woman named Ruth Scott, who was a master's student at the Eastman School at the time. And she wanted to study the music that was in the Salem archives. So she contacted the archivist at the time, Adelaide Fries, and Fries invited her to come down. When she came down, she stayed with the Fole family, who we see over here. She wrote back that she was given the warmest welcome you could possibly imagine, was made to feel like a family member during her time here, and was just overwhelmed with what she was finding in the archives. So she goes on to tell people like David that there's all this stuff here that needs to be explored. This made Adelaide Fries a little bit nervous. So Fries, God bless her, was a bit paranoid. And she did not like the idea of Moravian music falling out of Moravian hands. And it got into her head that Scott was secretly a scout for the New York Public Library, and she was concerned that all these people were suddenly going to descend into Winston-Salem, steal all the music that was here, and we would never see it again. It would get published and disappear, and we'd have no control over it. So at that point, Adelaide essentially closed down the archives to outside visitors. She did, however, invite James Fole to come in and start poking around. So James, as you can see, the Fole family, they didn't just hold these instruments, they played them, and they were a very musical clan. James is the one holding the trumpet. So this is him as a young kid, that's him a little bit older. He was head of music at the time at Davidson College, and so he was invited in. He began to explore what was here, and he, as a result, published some of the music, including probably the most famous one, which is Leinbach's piece. So, yeah. So with this, you start to see these publications, people beginning to realize that there's all this stuff here that no one has paid any attention to up until this point. Now, one may ask, why in the 1930s is all this stuff starting to happen? And we have to recognize that in this period, it's obviously the Great Depression, but it's also the time of the New Deal. And one of the catalysts of the New Deal was this notion of giving jobs to people who needed them. Artists, scholars, etc. David had actually gotten his grant to study Moravian music as part of this New Deal. And in particular, what you see during this time is an effort to try to elevate American musical culture. Right? This is the time of Ruth Crawford Seeger, Charles Seeger, the Lomaxes, when they were going around and they were capturing this music and preserving it and publishing it. So you see this real strong effort to try to codify and create an American musical repertoire as well as an American musical history. And so it makes sense that a lot of this interest in Moravian music suddenly starts to pick up in the 1930s when there's this larger national desire to really start to formalize this notion of what it means to be American and what exactly American music is. And when you think about the early origins of a lot of American music, the Moravians played obviously a very important role in that. Now, the next big generation involved in creating the foundation came about in the 1950s. So obviously with the war in the 40s, things kind of fizzled out a little bit. In the 1950s, you have the sparks really starting to explode into flames. And there are two seminal figures in the 1950s that we owe the foundation to. The first is Thor Johnson, the famous conductor. Thor Johnson, I'm going to read this because I always get it wrong. He was the youngest American-born and trained conductor of a major American orchestra, and that was the Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra, which he assumed the position of in 1947. And you may wonder, why in the world is the conductor of the Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra interested in Moravian music? And that's because his dad was a minister in the Moravian church, right? So, at Friedberg, right. So in 1950, we have the first ever festival dedicated to Moravian music. Today they're known as the Moravian Music Festivals, but at the time it was the early American Moravian Music Festival. And this are some photographs from that first 1950 festival. This is Thor Johnson here.
Is that Bethlehem?
Yes, took place in Bethlehem. Now, the other major figure who helped to found the foundation was Donald McCorkle. And we see McCorkle over there in the top photograph. He became interested in Moravian music around 1954 when he received a grant to study the Salem Collegium Musicum here in the archives. So that publication, that work, eventually became his dissertation. And it also helped to shine a spotlight, again, on a lot of the music that people didn't realize was here to start with. So people had kind of heard these rumors that there were things floating around in the archives, but that's where it all basically stopped. And so with McCorkle's dissertation, he was able to start, again, shining a spotlight and making people recognize there could actually be stuff here. We just need to spend the time actually going through it. With these two figures in mind, so this is a later festival. Oh, it's fine. It's Moravians. We're all in everything. So this was the 1959 festival, which happened after the foundation had been formed. So this was one of the first foundations after the founding of the Moravian Music Foundation. You'll see Thor Johnson still conducting. He conducted 11 festivals, basically up until his death in 1972. He died fairly unexpectedly. He was actually planning the next festival and he died, so they had to very quickly find a conductor to take over for him. But you see some of the people involved in it. Recordings were made that were really important there.
This is all without air conditioning.
I was going to say,
104 degrees.
yeah, so the photograph here, the concert took place outside on the square, and it is made note on the back of the photograph that in the shade that day, it was 102 degrees Fahrenheit.
The recording
So,
was 104 though.
oh, I bet, sorry. So when you see all these people dressed to the nines in their fashionable clothing, just keep in mind it is 104 and humid. Yeah,
Look, Thor Johnson's shirt down there.
exactly, yeah. So it's a North Carolina summer.
Soaking wet.
And he didn't wear shorts back then, so that's what we deal with. So the idea for the foundation, we've seen kind of the roots being placed even as far back into the 19th century, the 1930s, 1950s, you start to finally have people saying we need to do something about it. So in 1956, 4 incorporators got together, and those 4 men were Kenneth Hamilton, R. Gordon Spa, Clarkson Starbuck, and Frederick Stoker, who got together and were the first 4 incorporators of what became the Moravian Music Foundation. They signed on May 2nd, 1956. The first meeting of the trustees took place the next month in June, and it was there that Donald McCorkle was unanimously elected as the first director of the Moravian Music Foundation. From the beginning, there was a lot of question as to what exactly the foundation should be. And McCorkle recognized very early on that this was a unique institution that was going to have some fairly unique problems. And so he wrote, just a couple years into his time as the director, that the foundation is unique and probably without precedent among music organizations in the United States. It is also an archives, an editorial board, a publisher, and philanthropy. Its responsibilities are formidable and its aspirations are boundless. If the foundation were to have a motto, it would probably be this: our Moravian forebears created great music solely for the glory of God. It is our responsibility to utilize this priceless legacy for no less exalted a purpose. When McCorkle came on board, the first big issue is how do we collect these materials? Prior to this, all of the music that you see in the collections of the foundation, whether here or in Bethlehem, were either in the hands of the congregations or it was in the archives, the Northern Province Archive, the Southern Province Archives. And so with the formation of the Music Foundation, they have to go and collect the music and get people to agree to hand the music over to them. So with some legal assistance by Robert Brawley, they created some agreements with the congregations. And the first group to sign over their works was the Southern Provincial Elders Conference and Salem Congregation. So they signed the agreement October 27th, 1958. A couple of months later, the Northern Provincial Elders Conference and Bethlehem Congregation signed their agreement, and that was December 9th, 1958. Later followed by Lidditz and Nazareth in 1961, and Dover in 1962. This is still true to this day. The Music Foundation does not own the music that is in our collection downstairs. Instead, we are the custodians of it. As McCorkle said, in effect, the agreements assign sole rights to the foundation for research, publishing, and recording of all music in the 2 archives of the Moravian Church in America. The foundation, in turn, has agreed to be responsible for accomplishing these things through its own means or through others designated by the foundation. So we preserve, we are the custodians of this music, but we do not own the music. It is still in the hands of the congregations. You can imagine as they start to look through these things, they begin to recognize there's some pretty remarkable stuff in these collections. If you've done the vault tour with Dave, you've seen just a couple of the things that we have, where they include a copy of Haydn's Symphony No. 17 that was copied in the hands of Friedrich Peter, that was considered the first preserved copy of the work in the world, so the earliest preserved copy that we have. There are also the only extant copies of 7 works by Johann Christoph Friedrich Bach and Johann Ernst Bach, so 2 of the Bach sons. Again, most of them in Peter's hands. The copies that he made are some of the only surviving copies of those works to this day. So major works by some pretty prominent composers of the time that have basically disappeared, if not for what Peter had copied over and saved. These pieces and works, they were not always found in the most usual places. So some of them were in the archives, great. The Dover collection was in a cracker box that was kept in the church's attic. In Nazareth, it was found in the organ chamber. There was a collection of music that had been stuffed back there that they were able to find and uncover. Donations were also made. Donations are constantly being made, but people would come and bring things to the foundation. We got some pretty remarkable stuff. The 26 Regiment Band books were provided by donation. A microfilm copy of the 1501 Czech hymnal was given by the Czech embassy in recognition of the foundation, as well as a number of hymn books, tune books, all sorts of stuff. One of the greatest donations we received was from Irving Lowens, who worked for the Library of Congress in the music division. He was also music critic of the Washington Star. He wrote on American hymnology and collected a lot of old tune books. He donated those to the Salem congregation, which gave them to the foundation. And he had a reason for this. So Lowens was interested both in American hymnology. He was also a consultant for the early Music Foundation, so they didn't really have money to pay him, but they gave him a nice title, and he would kind of give some insight and help out along the way. But he wrote, "It is my sincere desire to honor the foundation for its remarkable and spectacular successes in the past 5 years by giving it still another challenge. The Moravian Music Foundation is an extraordinary organization, surely one of the really important musical institutions in the United States. It will give me great satisfaction to watch the development of the Musical Americana collection and to provide the Music Foundation with a head start toward achieving its objective, which I see as the major center of research in the history of American music, non-Moravian as well as Moravian, in the entire southeastern part of the country." For Lowens, he had grand ambitions for what the foundation could become, and his giving of his collection was his way of kind of showing the confidence that he had in what the Moravian Music Foundation could achieve in its future. Our library, which is downstairs in the reading room, was begun in 1960 with a purchase of a 1544 Gesangbuchlein. This was, at the time, bought for $465, which today is about $4,600. A couple years later, in 1961, that library became known as the Pater Memorial Library because of a $20,000 donation by Lily Pater, who was the grandniece of Frederick and Simon Pater. We achieved our 501c3 status in 1959, which was a big, important deal for the foundation, and then realized that we needed some space. So originally, the Moravian Music Foundation was housed on the lower floor of the old archives building on Bank and Main Street, the Vorsteher House. By 1961-62, McCorkle said it was hard to move around the rooms because there were so many books and things stacked everywhere. Basically, there was a narrow little walkway to get from one place to another. And so he started to argue we need to look towards expansion. And so the board met and agreed that they needed to find a home for the foundation. And they considered a couple different places. They were actually interested possibly moving to the Fine Arts Center of Salem College. They also were looking at some locations in Old Salem, including, I kind of wish they had done the Butner House, which is that yellow house with a porch that hangs out over the sidewalk, which would be a pretty cool place to work. That didn't happen. The thing with Salem College kind of fell through. There was an empty lot in Old Salem that they considered purchasing and then building on there, but the money was just going to be too much. And so instead, they settled on a house just down the road on Cascade Avenue, 20 Cascade Avenue. A grand, very stately home that would become a thorn in the side of the foundation for the next couple of decades. It is a beautiful house, but it is an old home with all the problems that go along with an old home. But you can see some of the photographs of the parlor, the dining room, just the outside. It's a beautiful building. It didn't have a vault, obviously, because most people don't construct vaults for their homes. So that had to be built. And this is them building the vault in the backyard. So they had to build a big hole, kind of fill it in with concrete and do all that work. These are some photos from the inside of the Cascade Avenue vault room, just to give you a sense of what it looked like. This was part of their mission to preserve the collection, but they were also interested in sharing it. And one of the main ways they did this was through festivals, like the 1959 festival we were just talking about, as well as recording contracts with companies like Columbia. So Columbia Records signed a deal to record some Moravian music. There were some issues that came along with this. There was some fighting at Columbia. Essentially, there were some people who thought that the record that came out of it was the greatest thing that Columbia had ever produced. And there were some people who thought the opposite. I'm trying to think of the nicest way to put it, but we're maybe not so on board with the project. So it kept getting pushed back and delayed and caused a lot of issues along the way. But it did eventually come out. There's a copy down in the archives that we have of it, and it became a pretty important record in helping to preserve and share a lot of this Moravian music. If you're curious what this other photograph, this is a 1954 seminar that McCorkle took part of, and this is him standing right there. So he's in that group of students right there. Now, with McCorkle, one of the big problems, and this is going to honestly face every director who comes in charge of the foundation. What is the Music Foundation, and what are its goals? McCorkle put forth 4 divisions within the foundation: administration, research, publications, and education. And he had grand ideas. So some of the things he wanted to do: catalog all the music in the collection, conduct research, encourage other people to do research, build the collections, so make them bigger, add more stuff to them, edit music that was in the collections for publications, create educational projects that could be disseminated amongst different organizations, cooperate with schools and churches in the performance of the music, serve the church and the public, build a research center out of the foundation that could rival any research center in the country, and then use the legacy of the music to praise God. These are grand endeavors, a lot for one man to accomplish. And within just a few years, it became obvious to McCorkle that it was far too much for one person to do. And after being here a couple years, he decided that he no longer had the energy and enthusiasm to be able to accomplish all that needed to be done here. And so with that, he sadly relinquished his time at the foundation and went on to teach at the University of Maryland. I want to mention, and every now and then I'll kind of talk about these people who were not directors, but played seminal roles in helping to preserve and spread this music. Marilyn Gombosi. She was the assistant director and chief of research in the 60s, from 1961 to 68. So she overlaps kind of the end of McCorkle's time. One of her primary jobs was getting the library in order and starting the process of cataloging the materials that were in the collection. And today she is, or at least 2 of her great legacies with the foundation were the publications of 2 works. So the first was the Herbst collection. She was the editor of that, as well as a reconstruction of the Psalm of Joy, which was published as a Day of Solemn Thanksgiving by UNC Press. Psalm of Joy, if you're not familiar, is considered one of the first celebrations of the July 4th holiday. It took place here in Salem and is held every year in honor of that. It's going to be held again this year as well. So I'm going to pass these around just so you can get a look at them. But these are 2 things that Gombosi helped to contribute to us. Now, after Gombosi, Nolta became our next director. So Nolta was a little bit older than McCorkle. So he had about 2 decades of experience on McCorkle, which helped to kind of lead the foundation into a new direction. He had gotten his Ph.D. from Northwestern University, began the position of director on September 11th, 1964. And one of the big things he did as the director of the foundation was to expand the offerings. So to expand the collection, but also to expand who we were reaching out to. One of the ways he did this was through the designation creation of what became known as Moravian Music Sunday. In 1967, the board asked the provincial elders conferences to create a Moravian Music Sunday. The Southern Province was the first one to agree to this. Originally, it was the Sunday before Ash Wednesday. Obviously, now it's been pushed back, and technically you could do Moravian Music Sunday any Sunday that you wish now. It's not a specific date, although this year it's technically May 7th. But again, every congregation can choose the date that they want to celebrate. But it's a way to help spread, again, the message of Moravian music and the importance of that heritage within the church. He also helped to build the collection. One of his great items that he brought in was a hymnal that became important. It was the 1618 Czech hymnal that was given by Dr. Vlastislav Viafilov, who was director of the Kralitz Museum in the Czech Republic. So again, a recognition of the importance of the foundation and a sign that there are people outside of the United States who are recognizing the significance of this organization. One of the big themes, again, he faces, that everyone faces, is Cascade Avenue. So within just a couple years, issues start to pop up water damage from leaking. There were humidity issues in the vault. They could never quite get it right. They didn't help. They made a couple of interesting choices, one of those being to carpet the vault, which I guess made it more comfortable to walk in. But when you're building a place that's supposed to try to preserve materials, putting in material that is famous for collecting dust and water is probably not the greatest choice. So that decision would come back later to be a big problem. But they also had just the typical things you had to deal with. One of the big themes of the 20th century were termites, which constantly attacked the building and led to a lot of damage as well. Nolta, like McCorkle, faced the reality that the foundation requires a lot of work. There's a lot of different arms that the director has to have, a lot of different facets of the job. And over time, it just got to him. Much like it had with McCorkle, there's so much you have to do that he really just didn't feel like he was up to it anymore. And so eventually he decided to retire. In his final report, he wrote that the uniqueness of the foundation derives from only one historically fortunate fact: the vast collections of music in the Moravian Church's archives relating to the last years of the American colonial period and the first decades of the United States of America. Into this rich archival subsoil, the foundation must drive deep roots. The foundation is not needed to foster anything else but attention to this musical treasure trove. Various activities may find their place in the foundation's program, but if they interfere with keeping a sharp focus on the unique collections of music, they are robbing the foundation of the particular and peculiar reason for its existence. So you can kind of see in that report one of the big issues that drove Nolta to ultimately retire was the question of what direction the foundation should take. And for him, he felt like it was starting to lose its focus, being centered on the music of the colonial period and the early years of the American nation, and view that it was maybe turning towards opening up and popularity and losing that touch. And so that became one of his big bones of contention, is ultimately one of the reasons why he decided that it was time for him to retire. While he was director, one of the important figures, Frances Cumnock, who was cataloger and librarian and served as chief cataloger. Her time at the foundation, she was here for a while, from 1968 to 1982. We'll talk about the cataloging process in a little bit, but while she was chief cataloger, the foundation received a number of grants, and she really helped to spearhead that project, so it was seminal in that. One of her legacies is she was the editor of the catalog of the Salem Congregation Collection, so I'll pass this around. Her name is on that. She apparently had a working style that, several photos of her doing this, so apparently she loved to sit on the floor and surround herself with things. I think Dave would kill me if he walked into my office and saw me doing that today, but since he's retiring, I maybe can get away with this come next week. So don't let Dave back in the building unless you tell me. That's how she liked to do. Her typist, by the way, Paul Canals, if anyone recognizes him, sitting there at her desk there. So she helped with the Salem Congregation Collection as well as working on the Lidditz Congregation Collection, was something that came out a couple years later, and I'll pass that around later. After Nolta, our next director, Carl Krager, he served as director beginning in 1972, so he took over the 5th of September of that year. He had gotten his Ph.D. at Brown University while he was actually starting to work here, and he worked at a number of prominent places, did his studies at a couple of different institutions, including University of Wisconsin at Madison. With Krager, one of the big things that comes out of his tenure is the cataloging project. So while he was the director, the foundation, I'll come back to the slide in a second. I want to show some of the work that was done here. The foundation received 3 different grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities. And these 3 grants were designed to give money to help catalog the collections of the southern and northern provinces. Because it was such a monumental task, they had to hire additional catalogers. So Frances Cumnock was one of them, Jeanette Ingram was one, and then up in Bethlehem, for the first time we hired people in Bethlehem as part of the foundation's work, and that was Stillman and Claypool, who you see over there on the left-hand side. Again, on the floor, the carpeted archives floor. So maybe this is the reason why they carpeted it, is because she liked to sit on the floor and do her work there. But That's her with Krager working, and then this is the Salem office of them getting some of their work done. I do want to note, when we catalog a piece of music, it is not just putting the title down and the composer on a note card and putting it into those catalogs that we see downstairs. With each of the records, they needed a catalog number, which indicated whether it was handwritten or printed, composer and dates, a title, tempo indications, the key, number of measures, source of the text, instrumentation and voicing, alternate text, cross-references to other occurrences of the piece within the collection. And then one of the really important things they did is they included musical enchipments for each of the works that was also included. And if you go down to the card catalogs and look at them, you can actually see these handwritten musical enchipments that were tacked on to each one. So tens of thousands of works of music that they had to do. It was a massive endeavor. It took years and years and years. And they still didn't get everything. The collections, and I'm going to read like one of those warnings at the end of a medicine commercial real fast, so just bear with me. But these were the collections that were cataloged. The Bethlehem Congregation, Bethlehem Philharmonic Society Collection, Salem Congregation Collection, Salem Collegium Musicum Collection, Lidditz Congregation Collection, Lidditz Collegium Musicum Collection, Bethlehem Miscellaneous Collection, Bethlehem Bound Printed Music Collection, Bethlehem Music Book Collection, Salem Manuscript Copybook Collection, Salem Bound Printed Music Collection, Salem Band Book Collection, Salem Love Feast Odes, Bethania Congregation Collection, Lidditz Music Book Collection, Lidditz Bound Printed Music Collection, Lidditz Miscellaneous Collection, Lancaster Congregation Collection, Nazareth Congregation Collection, Lancaster Music Book Collection, Lancaster Bound Printed Music Collection, Dover Congregational Collection, Clarence E. Beckel Collection, H.E. and S.S. Titz Collection, D.G. Samuels Collection, and the Pater Codex. So again, not everything we have, but a pretty good chunk of the collection that they were able to catalog. It resulted in roughly about 30,000 of those little cards. While they're going through everything, they make some pretty major discoveries. The most famous one that if you've ever done a vault tour here, you have seen is the first edition of the Star-Spangled Banner. But we also found first editions of Mozart's Prague Symphony, Haydn's String Quartets, Opus 77, which if you study any music history, you know those are some of the seminal string quartets in the history of music, and Beethoven's Overture to Fidelio. While all this is going on, the collections are also expanding. So they received the Vardell Jr. Collection and the Emanuel Erba Collection. And some interesting things are also happening. So we have to remember, while Krager is in charge, we are in the 1970s, it is the Cold War. Herrnhut is in East Germany, and in 1967, connection is basically cut off from them. So they're not allowed to receive any of the publications from the Moravian Music Foundation. So beginning around 1973, the archivist in the Netherlands, in Utrecht, Dr. Leuenweber, he basically contacts the foundation and says, we will serve as a leeway between you and Herrnhut. So when we have publications, we sent them to the Netherlands. And then Leuenweber either would mail the publications to Herrnhut, or what would normally happen is he would use human couriers. So when people would go visit Herrnhut, they would sneak these things in their luggage to the archives in Herrnhut. And so we finally started to have connections with Herrnhut in 1973, although it takes kind of a roundabout way of doing it. But what it did is it avoided the really strict East German codes where they would go through all the mail that was coming in, especially from the United States. So when you had the Netherlands stamp, they didn't look as closely as if it had had a Winston-Salem address on it. So we were able to get some stuff into the archives that otherwise we wouldn't have been. One of the other big things during this period, we're reaching out to more scholars, and one of the big seminal moments is the inclusion of several articles in the New Grove Dictionary of Music, which, unless you're a nerd like me, probably does not mean a single thing to you, but the New Grove is the music dictionary in the United States and England. It is the source of music history. So the fact that we had 5 articles included in that was a huge step forward in recognition. And those 5 articles were one on John Antis, one on John Friedrich Peter, one on Herbst, Charles Hohmann, and then a general essay on Moravian music in America that Gregor wrote. So finally, you start to see inroads being made in the scholarly community, and more people are starting to recognize the importance of Moravians in American music history. You'll also notice in his dates, he served from 72 to 80. So what major American event occurred during his tenure here at the foundation? The bicentennial, right, which became a huge event for Moravian music. Because you can imagine, suddenly there's a lot of interest in 1776. And what was one group that was really active in 1776, especially with music making? The Moravians. And so a lot of symphony orchestras began to contact the foundation to get sources and pieces of music that they could perform on special bicentennial events. It was during that period that work was done on the Psalm of Joy, and you start to see a concert and recording made of that work. It was also during this period that the Music Foundation was named a, quote, landmark of American music. And this was a project that had been put on by the National Music Council, the Music Educators National Conference, the National Federation of Music Clubs, and the Exxon Corporation, because we needed money apparently. And they named 200 persons, organizations, and places as seminal American musical treasures. And the Music Foundation was one of those 200 items that they listed. Now, with all of this fame came added pressure. And again, the question of what is the foundation and what is the purpose of the foundation. Gregor became very worried that we were moving towards becoming too popular, and we were losing touch with the scholarly aspect of the foundation. And this is when he first started to propose a new idea, which is that maybe there shouldn't be one director. But instead, what if we split the job? Because as McCorkle, Nolta, Gregor are starting to notice, this is not a one-person position. And so he first floated the idea, what if we had an arts administrator as the director and a musicologist on staff to do all the research and scholarly stuff? That maybe we keep having the same problem over and over again, maybe we need to find a solution to that problem. And so this is what he proposed. Didn't really go anywhere. And so as a result, just like with his predecessors, he realized it was a lot of stuff on his plate. He really couldn't handle it, and he decided at that point to retire. And with that, we embark on a new era. Now, before we move on to the next director, again, just some recognition of other people who were seminal in helping to build the foundation. Janine Ingram, who served as cataloger and assistant director from 1973 to 1982. One of her major works was in the Salem Collegium Musicum collection, but she worked alongside of the other catalogers in helping to catalog the collection in the 1970s. One thing that's really cool, after she left the foundation, she got some degrees in computer science and mathematics and then went to work for the Bell Labs for the rest of her career until she retired in 1999. So had two very completely different and successful career paths, which I think is remarkable. As someone who still has to use my fingers to count up tip when I go out to eat, or I just hand it to my wife most of the time. But when she's not around and I have to use my fingers, I just find that remarkable that she could go on and have that other life after this. These are just some photos. While Gregor is director, again, the bicentennial, this was a celebration that happened in the Lebanon congregation. So these were events that happened all throughout the country. There were about 12 or 13 different events that happened that year to celebrate Moravian music. We were talking about Moravian Music Sunday. In addition to just naming a Moravian Music Sunday, there were workshops to go out into the world and to teach this music to directors, but also congregation members. We're in the Winston area. Most of you probably recognize this fellow right here, Geeser, right? And then that's Gregor here, attending one of these workshops that happened here in the Winston-Salem area. But they also traveled around the country to other congregations as well. Now, things start to take a little bit of a turn in the next couple of directorships. Boehringer becomes our next director. He takes over in July of 1980. He's very optimistic, has high hopes for the foundation. He comes up with strategic plans. He builds it in 8-year increments because all of his predecessors before him had served 8-year terms. So he had an 8-year plan and then a 15-year plan. When he comes on board, he begins a process of what he referred to as housekeeping, both literal and figurative housekeeping. So when he got there, he was looking through the attics and noticed there were things like a set of deer antlers. There was a toilet bowl just sitting there, a shell collection. So he thought maybe we should find a better home for these. So he proposed we have an auction to help kind of get rid of that stuff and also raise some money. But he also wanted to kind of clean up house. At this point, there was very little institutional record keeping going on because everyone was so busy with everything else. And so what he wanted to do was start creating lists of things that had both been done but also were going to get done. So he wanted to create a list of all of the works that had been published by the foundation. He wanted to go through and make a list of edited music, but also, importantly, music that had been edited but had not been published yet. Because there were all these works that people had spent time on, they just hadn't been published. And his concern was people were going to spend all this time editing the same piece of music. And so wouldn't it be nice to have a list to go through to see, oh, someone else has already done this, I'm not going to spend my time working on it. He worked on creating a union catalog. So at this point, all the congregation catalogs were kind of kept separate. He wanted to create one big one that was alphabetized by composer, so there would at least be some central place, repository, where you could go and refer to the pieces without having to know it's in the Lidditz collection or it's in the Bethlehem collection. But what if we had one big catalog that you could look at? His time here was short, as we'll talk about, but it was also significant. He created a very short-lived Moravian Music Foundation press, published 3 books, a history of Hagen, a biography of his life, Music in the Ohio Church by Hartzell, and then the transcription and republication of Gregor's chorale book, which came out in 1784. Gregor, by the way, if you don't know, is the theme of this year's Moravian Music Sunday, because this is his 300th anniversary. He was born in 1723. Boehringer was the editor of this. I'm going to pass it around just so you can see. Only 3 books came out of the press because they realized it didn't make financial sense, but they did have 3 pretty important works. His time had ups, it also had downs. This photograph, you'll notice people working on putting together an application for the National Endowment for the Humanities. So we had gotten the cataloging grants. They wanted a grant to create a history of Moravian music. So they put together this massive application, they sent it off, and it was denied. With the denial of that application, they realized the 4 catalogers that they had been paying, they no longer could afford. And so essentially 2 days after they found out that they had not gotten the grant, they had to fire the 4 catalogers. And you can imagine it's a pretty dark moment in the history of the foundation. And it led to kind of some rocky tension between Boehringer and the board. He described this period, and I want to be careful with this language, because he described it as a time of sifting, which if you just read through that, might not give you much to pause over, but if you know the history of the Moravian Church, that is a very loaded term, a time of sifting. You go back to the history of the church, the 1740s, that era of the church's history is referred to as the sifting time, the time of sifting. And so his use of that phrase is significant. Things really didn't get much better for him. And unfortunately, a couple of years later, in '84, he left the foundation. And again, it was a question of what are the priorities and questioning what direction should the foundation take, where are we going to go from here? One of the things that came up during his time was that the collections were in some danger. The Cascade Avenue building might have been beautiful, but it was problematic, and the works needed some help. So in 1982, Boehringer brought in Paul Coda, who is curator of rare books and adjunct associate professor of library science at Chapel Hill, and he told him these things need to be taken care of now. They went and got a second opinion from David Olson, who was the archivist for the state of North Carolina. He told him the exact same thing. And so they realized they needed to do something to preserve the collections, but at the time they didn't have the money or resources to do that. Out of this discussion, though, Archie Davis proposes the idea that we should build a new home for the Music Foundation. And his initial idea was not to build a building for the foundation, but for a whole conglomerate of people. So he wanted it to be the homes of the foundation, the archives, the Salem College, they could have a part of it, the Wachovia Historical Society, and Old Salem as well, their museums. So basically to have this massive complex where all these different organizations were working together under one roof. that obviously never came to fruition, and a few years later it got whittled down to just the archives and the foundation. But you see in 1983 the first spark of people arguing that maybe we need to think about moving out of Cascade Avenue if we really want to preserve these works for the future. When Behringer left, the board came up with 4 priorities that the next director needed to keep at the forefront. Attention to the preservation of the collections, research, editing, and publishing of music, promotional activities and educational programs, and then other outside editing and publishing obligations. So the guy that they, the man, the figure,
My husband.
Kyle Kepa, exactly. Kepa was our director from 1985 to 1991. I love his educational background because he went more places than most of us will probably ever go in our entire lives. He's Hungarian, so he studied in Hungary, but then went to the French Lycée, studied in Turkey at the Istanbul University, went on to get a master's diploma in organ and composition from the Conservatory of St. Cecilia in Rome, and then went to Juilliard where he got his MS in orchestral conducting. Taught at Brooklyn College, a place near to my heart. It's part of the group that I got my doctorate from, the CUNY system, and was tasked to come on board to take over in 1985 while he was still teaching at Brooklyn. So for the first couple of months, he was kind of up there, down here, up there, down here. But when we look at his legacy, we owe a lot to him, in particular because it is through him that our collections survived, right? We see the problem that had been laid out, that we are nothing without our music, without the collections that are downstairs. And if he hadn't stepped in and really led that movement, most of those works would not have made it. Under him, Tim Pyatt, you might know Tim, he's over at Wake Forest right now, was brought in as the preserver. And these are some photos of Tim at work. To save money, Tim actually did most of the work himself, especially the deacidification process, which you can see him at work here. Also, when you go on a vault tour and you look at the book collection, the books that are wrapped in the paper, that was all done by Tim as a way to help preserve the bindings that are there. Putting them in acid-free boxes as well. So when you go over to the manuscript collection, you see everything in these gray boxes. That was Tim's effort in doing that. Unfortunately, though, he left after a year and a half. Well, unfortunate for us. Fortunate for Tim because he got a job as the rare books curator at Washington University. So it was a big step forward for his career. But after him, James Bates, who you might know, he was director of Moramis for a while, really active in the music community here. He took over and he helped to finish the project, which was supposedly wrapped up in 89. All this was done in the Winston-Salem office. It was not done in the Bethlehem office. So there's still a lot of work that needs to be done up there, but this is the money that we had available at the time to do it here. In this period, one of the ideas that starts to get floated around is how can we preserve these works with new technology? And this is when you first start to see the notion of microfilming becoming a priority as a way to help to preserve these collections for the future. Again, because it happens with every single one of these directors, Cascade Avenue, more issues, termites, water damage, on and on and on, things they have to deal with on a daily basis, which are problematic, but also, if you own a house, you know that all costs money. And so when you want the money to help preserve the manuscripts and you're having to spend it to repair termite damage, you're just bleeding things that you really don't have the ability to bleed out. So that's one of the headaches that all of these directors are having to deal with. When Kepa came on, just like everyone else, he had plans. And so his projects that he thought were priorities were, again, cataloging all of the collections, more of what had been done in the 70s, but making sure everything was cataloged, organizing all of the institutional records, publishing the catalogs. So it's not enough just to have them, but also getting them out there in the world so people know what's here and can look us up. Creating a choral library of unpublished music, so music that people have done the work for but haven't been published by a house, but they can still have access to it to perform in their organizations or churches, universities. Creating a catalog of published Moravian music, caring for our audio recordings, which, just as a side note, is still a big problem that we have to deal with at the foundation, making sure that those audio recordings are safe and that they're going to last for future generations. If you have some extra money lying around and you want to help to donate to that cause, it is a very worthy one, and that is my spiel for the day. Organizing music of the later composers. So we have been building our collections, and by later composers, he meant those who were still living. So the time, Charles Vardell, Margaret Sandreski, who's still with us to this day, making sure that those collections are cataloged and are growing and building. Cleaning up the building, the attic was a mess, so going through there and seeing what was contained in that building. And then determining and coming up with a policy for what to do with donations. Because again, Moravians don't throw anything out, but they do love to give it to other people. So oftentimes they would come up and give us boxes of stuff, figuring out what we need to do with all of those materials. Moramis Chorale had been founded earlier, but had basically disappeared, and so he helped to bring it back, where it resumed throughout his directorship. It was again disbanded after he left, but was brought back with James Bates a couple years later, and it's still active today. And they're actually going to be, I'll plug one more thing, they'll be performing on May 12th over at the Gray Auditorium with the Tannenberg organ. So if you're looking for something fun to do Friday, May 12th, that is there for you. 1986, he celebrates the 30th birthday of the Moravian Music Foundation. It's turned out to be an auspicious year for the foundation because that was also the year I was born, so I think it's pretty important. And then looked into reevaluating how it is all organized and structured. So again, the same issue that had faced every director before him. It's too much work for one person. How are we going to handle the obligations and stresses that come along with this job?
How many thousands of hours that takes, it's like living another lifetime in addition to your job.
And that, well, I didn't mention it, but that's the tension, was all the administrative responsibilities, but then that editing of the music, which takes, as Eric said, just hours and hours of time. And they're editing tens of hundreds of works during their time. I mean, that is just hours and hours of time, often done outside of office hours. So having to go home and do that because you spent the whole day having to deal with just the nitty-gritty tasks that go with running an organization. So that was, again, that source of tension was they're required to do things like editing, but also you have to deal with just the realities of you have an organization like this and everything that goes into it. And so when he leaves in 1991, the board finally decides maybe we need to rethink how we're doing things. And they come up with the idea of splitting the directorship into two different positions. To hire an administrator to be the executive director, and then hire someone as a musicologist on staff. And so to see this through, they hired Schultz as director. He was the very first non-musicologist to serve in the role of directorship of the Moravian Music Foundation. At the same time, just a few months later, they hired Nola Canals as the resident musicologist to serve on staff. Schultz was very ambitious, but a lot was put on his plate. There have been problems building at Cascade Avenue, as I've mentioned, for years. It all came crashing down during his tenure. In 1992, there was a water main break in the line to the building, which caused extensive damage they had to deal with. And then I mentioned that carpet was going to come back from the vault, so this is when it comes back. 1993, the sump pump into the vault broke, so the carpet got wet. It soaked up all the moisture, and they started to notice that the books in the vault were beginning to mildew. And so they had to take everything out of the vault. They had to house it in two locations. The archives, our friends over at the Vorster House took some of the stuff they could, and then Home Church took the rest of the collections. They had to tear up the carpet. They finally decided maybe this is not the best idea, and they got rid of it. They had to repaint everything. They had to move. There was a drain in the vault. They had to move it to a better location. And then they rearranged all the shelving so that it would allow for better airflow. Then everything had to dry, so that took a couple more months. And finally, they were able to bring everything back into the building. Now, you cannot make this stuff up. The day that they were bringing everything back into the building, a thunderstorm sprang up because it's a North Carolina summer. So they're running everything into the building, and as they're bringing the last box in, lightning hit a tree in the yard, which was carried through a metal pipe into the building. And so all of the electrical equipment was completely fried. Nola and Schultz had to wait the night with the fire department to make sure that there wasn't going to be a fire erupt as a result of this lightning strike. And if you think that's bad enough. This was not the only time Cascade Avenue was hit by lightning. A couple years later in 2000, it was also hit by lightning that year as well, right before we moved over here. And it's funny, if you read old reports back in the 1950s and 60s when they chose Cascade Avenue, McCorkle goes on about how it's a beautiful location and they're not ever going to need air conditioning because it's up on a hill. And so the airflow just goes through the windows and it's just a natural air conditioning. It's perfect. Well, apparently being up on a hill is also a prime target for lightning strikes. So you get the good with the bad. One of the big moments that happened in 1992 was, unfortunately, the death of Stoker, who was the last of the 4 original incorporators. And so in 1992, the foundation literally enters a new era with the passing of that last original generation. Schultz had some tension with the board, and in 1993, the end of that year, he was let go with 3 months' notice. And after him, the musicologist on staff, Nola Canals, took over the directorship. And as we begin with Nola's tenure, I do want to note, I'm not going to spend as much time with Nola, not because she doesn't deserve it, because obviously she needs an entire lecture on her own. Not only was she at the helm of the organization for basically half of its existence, but also she spearheaded it through some amazing projects. But because of time, as well as the fact it is more recent history that most of us are fairly familiar with, I am going to kind of not shortchange her, but not give her necessarily the time that I do want to mention that she does deserve. She became the director in 1994, and one of the great things she provided coming on board was a sense of stability, which is something that the foundation desperately needed at that time. So she put in place some important organizational policies, again, to help kind of right the ship and make sure everything was moving along. And then, very significantly, it was under her tenure that they finally decided and were able to get the money to get out of Cascade Avenue. And so that's her actually with Daniel. And if you look closely, you'll notice they're sitting by some original plans for the Archie K. Davis Center. This is not how it actually looked, but these were some of the preliminary projects. Let's get in just a little bit so you can see the center. So obviously Archie Davis and his wife, Mary Louise. Over there are some of the architects and planners. If you look closely, you can see a kind of scale model of the Davis Center. And then Daniel and Nola actually standing on the site of the building now before the ground had been broken. So where they're at, there was originally a parking lot. You can kind of sort of see right here. They're on the steps that are coming down right there. If you look over towards Cedarhurst later. So why was this such a priority? Again, just like with Schultz, Nola had to deal with a lot of issues that came with Cascade. Again, termite damage, you can see some of the photographs of it, but also extensive water damage. And you'll see her pointing out some of the mildew and mold that was on some of the publications that were housed upstairs. So these were not in the vault, but they were still music publications that had to be thrown out because they were damaged by the mildew and the mold. With the construction of the Archie K. Davis Center, I'd just like to throw out these numbers. Construction began in 1999. It was finished in 2001 when it was dedicated in September of that year. This building is constructed of 78,000 bricks, 27,000 brick pavers, 1,245 cubic yards of concrete, 53 tons of steel, 32,000 roofing tiles, 31,600 linear feet of wood trim. And the ultimate cost was $5,953,000. A lot of that raised by donations, a lot of that also footed by Salem Congregation, who technically are still our landlords of the building. Now, with issues that arise because of things like water damage, it's in this period that NOLA and the board start to recognize there needs to be a greater effort towards preserving the collections, and that's when the microfilming project finally takes off. The company that was hired to make the microfilm reels was in Pennsylvania, and so NOLA and Daniel rented a van and packed it up in the back. So they laid down 2x4s, then plywood, then blankets, And they took the collections and they laid them down in the back, covered them with more blankets, and made 3 trips up to Bethlehem with all of the music. Apparently, they couldn't make the drive all in one day, so they did stay in a hotel every now and then and had to unpack everything in there. Now, she is not here for me to ask this question, but if you see Nola next time, I'm not sure if this box of Yingling has been opened or not, or what exactly the plan that she had with Daniel. There's a box of Yingling beer there, so I guess they had a good time on their trip. Alan Frank, assistant director, Albert Frank, yeah, I always know him as Al, so I just fill in the rest. Albert Frank, assistant director up in Bethlehem. He managed most of the microfilming project because everything was done up in Pennsylvania. So they would bring it to the archives up there. Albert would do the work, basically. What they wound up with at the end of the day were 208 reels containing 230,000 frames. There were 3 copies made. One is here in our vault. Another one is in Bethlehem in the vault up there. And the third one is in Herrnhut at the Unity Archives. And you can still go see those microfilms downstairs in our vault today. Weirdly enough, microfilm is actually one of the most stable technologies even to this day. So when we talk about preserving our collections, right now it's actually a pretty safe way to preserve all of that. And they chose microfilm instead of floppy disk, which was the other alternative, because if you remember floppy disk, they don't hold a lot, but they do take up a lot of space. So microfilm, at least when you roll it up, doesn't take up a ton of shelf space. The floppy disk we would have had to use, basically we've had to build a whole other building just to house the floppy disks that contain that. And then nowadays you have to deal with how you even look at that kind of stuff. With NOLA, one of the big things you had to deal with obviously was the new technologies. So you see that with the microfilming project, but you also see that with the birth of the internet and the idea of how do we share our collections. Well, one way we do that is by moving the catalog online. How do scholars find out about music? They go onto the internet. And so she helped to spearhead what became in the 2000s the Gemeincat project. And with the hiring of Barbara Strauss and Dave Bloom in 2014, you had kicking off of the Gemeincat project, which is one of the most important ways we as the foundation have of spreading our music and the knowledge of what we have to the rest of the world. And when you look at really the legacy of NOLA, it is moving the knowledge of the Music Foundation from being an American institution into being a global institution. And one of the most astute things she ever did as director was in describing the Music Foundation, she began to drop the description of it being a North American institution, and instead simply described it as a Moravian institution. Because as we all know, the Moravian Church is a global church. And she began to make connections with groups from places like South Africa and Nepal and South America and the Caribbean. And one of the things that we see under her tenure is the recognition that the Moravian Church is more than just Pennsylvania and North Carolina, but it is a global, worldwide church. And as the Music Foundation, we are in a position to serve as the Music Foundation for all Moravians. And so setting us up for where are we going to go next. And so with the next chapter of the foundation, last year, August 15th, Dr. Bruce Ernest took over as executive director, and then I was hired as director of programming and resident musicologist. And when we look towards where are we heading, in many respects, it is building off that legacy of NOLA, beginning to move beyond the foundation as a North American institution into being a music institution for all Moravians, regardless of where they come from, but telling the full story of Moravian music. Opening up the doors of the Archie K. Davis Center. So bringing the community into the building with events like today's open house, with this gift shop that we're starting, adding to that recognition and becoming a pillar of the Winston-Salem arts and intellectual community. And through that, expanding our educational outreach. We have started in the past couple of months going into daycares and teaching music to kids as young as 1.5 all the way up to 5 and 6 year olds. This summer, we're going to have a music camp for middle and high school students with chamber music for wind players. In the fall, we're going to have a community class teaching beginning music theory that will be held here for free. And so really laying the groundwork for thinking of the Music Foundation, both as a preserver of this important legacy and history, but also as a beacon and a pillar for arts and culture and knowledge, both in the Winston-Salem and Bethlehem area, but also hopefully worldwide as well. So thank you.